Stagflation, Mr. Posen, is that what the UK faces in 2017?
The answer is simply yes. It's not going to be as bad or as painful as the stagflation of the 1970s, but it is stagflation. It's a negative supply shock combined with very low productivity, which means inflation goes up and growth goes down. All that's happened is the confidence of the consumer, housing builders, and so on in the UK, fueled by some nonsense in the political sphere, kept them having faith in the UK economy that wasn't merited for the last few months. They're now waking up to reality.
What does this mean for the Bank of England, Adam? Because we're now actually seeing that, bets are increasing on a rate hike from the Bank of England. But would that hurt the bank's credibility, do you think, to make that sort of about face after they, have just eased?
Central banks always are reluctant to make an about face, but they never should let that interfere with doing the right thing. The real issue for the bank and for the MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee, is assessing how much this inflation shock gets transmitted through to the whole economy. So when I was on the MPC in 2009-10, we had a very large decline in sterling, and inflation shot up to 5%, and we looked through it. But I think it's different this time. I think it's different because there's much less faith in the UK economic regime. I think it's different because gilt prices are moving down rather than up. And I think it's different because this is a UK-specific shock. So the markets aren't crazy to price in some possibility of a hike.
You referred to a number there, which is 5%. I just wonder, Adam, does Carney have the appetite to allow inflation to run up to 5% before? Would that be his tolerance level before he hikes rates, or is there a lower benchmark?
I don't think the issue is so much the level, because if it goes to, say, 3.5%, but it goes to 3.5% at a time when gilt yields are rising, at a time when the government of the UK is doing large fiscal stimulus, possibly, and at a time when the current account is widening, is widening, then 3.5% inflation would be bad. The 5% inflation we tolerated a few years ago was when expectations were anchored, gilt prices were anchored, and there was plenty of room to do QE. So I think they have to look at it differently. It's looking at the inflation expectations, like the five-year, not the level.
Talking about sterling as well, Adam, I think you have shown some concern already about how far this has fallen, and of course the impact that would have on inflation and the economy. I mean, if we see sterling take another leg lower, what are the wider impacts of that beyond, of course, the impact that we've already seen on inflation?
Well, I think concern is not quite the right word, because sterling, as many people have remarked, essentially has to go down. If you don't have sterling go down when you've had a negative supply shock and a hit to the current account competitiveness, then you got to have a huge compression of wages and imports. I mean, that's essentially what happened to Greece, and you don't want that to happen to the UK. So if anything, I would expect sterling to go further down, and I would expect sterling to move more against the euro than it has, because it's actually moved too much against the dollar and less against the euro, whereas where they need the readjustment is with the euro.
Adam, our editor-in-chief caught up with James Gorman over in the United States. So I'm talking about Mr. Micklethwaite and James Gorman. And when he asked him, was there anything good about Brexit?
Right.
I can shorten this response, Adam, actually. There's nothing good about Brexit. So that's Gorman's words, right, not mine. In your opinion, Adam, let's try and step back for just a moment, because this onslaught is of negativity, hard Brexit, dirty Brexit. Adam, Posen, is there anything good that can come from Brexit?
No.
Well, do you know what? Do you know what? You can see James Gorman in a game of poker, and you can raise him, because that is, in a word, no. Then tell me this.
Sorry.
Is it just death by 1,000 cuts for this country? What do we face?
No,
Let's go forward 10 years in Posen's view. What's the view?
Right. So let's step it back. I mean, it can be very unquestionably bad and have no positive aspects but still not be terminal, right? So it can be that you have an injury and you get arthritis and you can't play the sports you used to play and you have to take a bunch of painkillers, but in the end it's not fatal and it doesn't destroy your life. I think that's the way to think about Brexit. It's going to be an ongoing source of chronic pain for the UK for the next several years, and it is going to put the UK in many ways back to where it was in the 70s and early 80s of being uncompetitive, people having less faith in the stability of the regime, and having to rebalance in very interventionist ways. So 10 years from now, will the economy have survived it? Of course. Will the city have survived it? Yes, in shrunken form. Will the average British person be worse off economically? Yes. The only way it's going to be able to be claimed a victory or something good is if, God forbid, something terrible happens in Europe. And then they can say, well, relatively speaking, it was good we weren't part of that. And I suppose that's possible. But even then, that's not going to protect the UK because even outside the EU, most of its trade is with the EU. So, it's not good. It's not the end.
I'm glad you mentioned the EU, because is this in fact in any way going to be more painful for Europe then? I mean, we get French GDP data later, but is this more of a problem for wider Europe than the UK, or is the UK going to take most of the pain?
I think the UK takes most of the pain, but I think the important thing, which you're implying and which I agree with, is that this was a mutually beneficial relationship. And so if you pull back from the relationship, the pain is on both sides. And the pain will be much less for the large European bloc than it is for the UK, but it will be there. And the pain primarily is going to be through the political aspect of, obviously, people more worried about fragmentary parties and right-wing parties and anti-Europe parties in Europe than they had been. And it's going to be the uncertainty that Scotland and Northern Ireland have as spillovers, which again is primarily bad for the UK, but has effects on the EU.